President Lula is back in power in Brazil. What can we expect for the country and the region? Hello, I'm Arnold Knight, and this is The Heat. On New Year's Day, leftist Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva was sworn in as Brazil's new president after a bitter political campaign against his right-wing predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro. This is Lula's third term as president and may be his toughest test yet. Our correspondent Paulo reports on the political and economic challenges ahead.
Tradition has it that the outgoing president puts the presidential sash on the incoming one, but not this time. Jair Bolsonaro left the country ahead of the inauguration of Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva. So instead, a group representing Brazilian society, including a black woman, a child, an indigenous leader, and someone with a disability did the job.
Fila na porta dos açougues.
There are queues in front of butcher shops of people seeking bones to alleviate their hunger. And at the same time, there are queues if you want to buy a private jet or a luxury car. Such social abyss is an obstacle to building a truly fair and democratic society.
The left-wing activists and groups that supported his election have high expectations for this new term.
I think priority number one, of course, is the situation of poverty. Brazil now came back to the map of hunger. There's millions of impoverished people now in the country, and this is, of course, the first task.
But how much of a leftist agenda Lula will be able to advance is one of the big questions now. To get elected, he had to rely on a wide alliance that included many conservative forces and figures, like his vice president Geraldo Alckmin, a former political rival.
Winning the presidency was a big victory for Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva and his Workers' Party, but major challenges are still ahead. One of them, reconciling the country that remains extremely polarized.
Lula's victory was narrow and hard-fought. Leaving roughly half the country unhappy, many of these voters are taking their loss in stride.
I hope good things will come from this government. We are all in the same boat. Lula da Silva was not my choice in these elections, but I defend democracy, and now we have to accept the results.
But a relatively large and noisy minority still questions the legitimacy of the elections. The inauguration of Lula has quieted many of them, some who spent weeks camped at army headquarters demanding military intervention. They are going home, but extremely resentful. For thousands of Lula supporters who traveled to the capital from all over the country to see their new president inaugurated, Sunday was a day for joy and optimism. Worry over what will likely be challenging times ahead could wait. Paulo, CGTN, Brasília.
To discuss what's ahead for Brazil, let's bring in our panel. From Sao Paulo, Gustavo Ribeiro is the founder and editor-in-chief of The Brazilian Report. Gilson Schwartz is a professor of economics at the University of Sao Paulo. Sergio Lima is a senior Brazil analyst at Medley Global Advisors. And here in Washington, D.C., Michael Shifter is former president of the Inter-American Dialogue. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Gustavo Ribeiro, let me start with you. President Lula has taken office with a promise to unite the country, and that promise comes after a very closely fought, a very bitterly fought election that saw an almost even divide between left and right. So given all of that, how difficult is it going to be for him to unite the country?
It's going to be extremely difficult because a large part of the Brazilian electorate does not see him as a legitimate leader. And so he will have to deliver results very quickly in order to avoid his approval ratings dipping. When Lula was president, he was extremely popular. He left office with over 80% approval rating. I would not expect something of that kind right now because when Lula left office, social media was in its infancy and we didn't have this massive divide in Brazilian society. So if he fails to deliver quick results, and that is going to be very tough because the Brazilian government is cash-strapped and the challenges abound. he's going to face a very tough opposition, I would assume.
Gustavo, you say that a large part of the Brazilian electorate don't see him as a legitimate leader, and that's very different from people opposing his policies, his legislative agenda, or his ideology. But is there a question mark over his legitimacy?
Well, for the hardcore supporters of Jair Bolsonaro, yes, because taking the president's cue, they believe that the election was stolen. For years, Bolsonaro has disparaged Brazil's electoral system without ever offering any shred of evidence to back his claims. And from the lame duck period of Bolsonaro between October the 30th and the inauguration, we saw a lot of violent acts of supporters who wanted to stir chaos and, in their minds at least, create the possibility of a stage of siege or any sort of problem that would prevent Lula from being inaugurated. We even saw on Christmas Eve a bomb plot near the Brasilia airport with that intent of creating chaos and allowing Bolsonaro to use exceptional measures, which of course didn't work.
Mario, the Brazilian military were actually out in force on Inauguration Day amid fears that there were supporters of former President Jair Bolsonaro who were out to disrupt proceedings on that day. But given all of that, I mean, is there a real risk of political instability in the country, given that these divisions are pretty deep?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. Yes, there is a risk. I don't think that we are looking at a risk of a staged coup d'etat or anything like that, a military coup. But we have reasons to believe that there will be lots of protests everywhere in the country. At any moment that Lula fails to deliver any of his promises, there are lots of people that were benefited by some allowing to reducing the controls of gun ownership in Brazil. So it's never very tranquilizing to know that people that are contesting the legitimacy of an election are bearing arms and could eventually try to stage any sort of disruption. So there is a risk, but I wouldn't say this I wouldn't call it as a base case. The most likely scenario is Lula having a very contentious government and not gaining a lot of support from people that are not from his already supporters. So he'll probably be a less powerful president comparatively than he was when he left more than 2 decades ago.
Gilson Schwartz, former President Jair Bolsonaro, he got 49% of the vote. That's effectively half the country, but he's not made any public appearances. In fact, he skipped the inauguration. He flew to the United States. He's in the United States state of Florida, in Orlando, I believe. But what about the movement he's left behind, that movement known as Bolsonarismo? Will it continue or will it lose steam with him out of the way?
Well, let me strongly disagree with our fellow participants tonight, because I really don't see not even a risk, not even a political risk. We have to stress that this has been one of the most important elections since the redemocratization process in Brazil began. After the military regime, there has never been such a wide alliance, such a wide scope, and with a high degree of participation. So I think that there is too much exaggeration in some of the analysis that pinpoint the possibility of a crisis, of a political crisis, or even of an economic or fiscal crisis, as so many economists now are putting out alerts that the fiscal situation is very complicated. As a matter of fact, despite all the complaints regarding the Bolsonaro regime during the last 4 years, as a matter of fact, Brazil has been one of the most benefited nations in terms of coming out of the pandemic and the economic crisis globally. As we know, Brazil hosts one of the most important agricultural export balance in the world. We have such a large and resourceful agricultural sector, and we already know that there will be an extra surplus crop this year, starting this year. So inflationary pressures are not that high. We have coming for the last couple of years, we have seen the reduction in the relation between the government debt and the gross domestic product. So there are so many interesting indicators in the economy, and coupling this analysis with an extremely wide political alliance, I don't see any risk. On the contrary, I think that we're going to see a changing of paradigm with a very, especially new importance to geopolitical issues.
Michael Schifter, how will the election of Lula be seen in the United States? I mean, here we have a left-leaning political leader in Brazil who has promised to address poverty. He has said that he will close the inequality gap in Brazil, generally level the playing field. He is not a leader who embraces any kind of neoliberal agenda. So do you expect a cordial relationship?
Absolutely. First of all, Washington sort of greeted the victory with great relief. Bolsonaro, as we know, took a long time to congratulate President Biden on his victory in 2020. And there had been enormous strain and enormous tension with the Bolsonaro government. And Bolsonaro was a pariah on the international stage. And so the Lula victory opens up an opportunity to re-engage with Brazil and to pursue a number of important issues. Probably the most important one being on climate change and the whole issue of the Amazon, the deforestation of the Amazon, which is of enormous concern, not only in the United States, but globally. And so I think there is a lot of expectation about working with Lula. Today, there was a conversation with Secretary of State Blinken, with the new foreign minister of Brazil, Mauro Vieira. And there'll be a trip in the next couple of months, a visit here to Washington, as well as a visit to Beijing. Lula is clearly want to have good relations both with the United States and with China, which I think is very reasonable, but it's going to be a challenge given the environment of enormous competition and strain and tension between the United States and China.
Michael, looking at the broader picture in Latin America, what kind of impact will Lula's election have on the region? You've focused a great deal on that part of the world.
Well, again, I think his victory has raised a lot of expectations. Bolsonaro was not just a leader of the right. He was somebody who operated outside of the parameters of democratic governance. And so Brazil really played virtually no role during the 4 years of the Bolsonaro government. And I think there is an expectation that there will be a push and an emphasis with Lula as the undisputed regional leader for greater integration. The region, clearly, he's talked about reviving UNASUR, which was the arrangement that started in 2008 under his leadership of South American governments, to try to work on a number of common themes. It's not going to be easy because the region, frankly, is not in good shape. If you look at neighbors like Argentina or even Chile or Peru and others, Venezuela, this is a very, very difficult moment. And so it'll be challenging, but clearly we're going to get a lot more than we've gotten in the past. And probably the Amazon, I think, is the one issue that will unite many of the governments in South America behind Lula's leadership.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that issue on the Amazon in a moment or so. But Gilson, Schwartz, I want to talk about the relationship with China. President Lula posted a tweet in which he said, and I'm quoting here, he said, "I received from the Chinese Vice President Wang Qishan a letter from President Xi Jinping with congratulations and the desire to extend cooperation. China is our biggest trading partner, and we can grow even further the ties between our countries." And President Lula also said that he's planning to visit China this year. This will be his first year in office. How important is that relationship, and where do you see it going?
Well, I think this is a key relationship. It was very important the Vice President came to the inauguration. And I do believe that all these changes in the governance, in international governance, are now going to count on Brazil as an important partner. we are, all of us in the South, we are fighting for a, let's say, a new non-alignment movement or a new process of overcoming the polarities of the Cold War. And I think that China and Brazil, as well as India and even Russia, we know there is the BRICS agenda. This will, along with Mercosur and other regional initiatives, these will also come back to the fore. So I think that we are entering a new paradigm of a sustainable international governance, and Brazil will play an important role in that process. China, of course, is our partner in that, and this relates to the importance of our agro-industrial sector and exports.
Michael, as Gilson says, the divisions of the Cold War are largely now gone, and I was wondering how the United States will respond to this growing relationship between China and, at least between Brazil and China.
Well, I think the United States recognizes that Brazil has made it very clear through President Lula and through Celso Amorim, who was a former foreign minister and very influential in Brazil's foreign policy, that Brazil wants to have good relationships with China. Obviously, it's the biggest trading partner, as we know, and there are a lot of opportunities to reindustrialize Brazil and really make advances in lots of different sectors. But the United States is also important, and there are a lot of things that Brazil looks forward to working with the United States on. And so I think the United States will have to accept and recognize that that's the reality. There's not going to be alignment on a number of issues like Russia and like Ukraine, where obviously there's a much stronger, more antagonistic relationship with the United States and Russia. But I think that there has to be an acceptance by the United States and a maturity that recognizes that Brazil that China is extremely important for Brazil, and that's a relationship that they have to respect and have to work with and emphasize the areas of cooperation where the United States really can contribute and play an important role in Brazil. And certainly the Lula government has given every indication that it's looking forward to that. It does not want to have a antagonistic or adversarial relationship with the United States.
Gustavo, President Lula won the presidential election, but the Brazilian Congress is controlled by conservatives. This is effectively the era of divided government in Brazil, although President Lula has reached out to his opponents. In fact, his vice president, Geraldo Alckmin, is a conservative. But how do you see this work? How do you see the day-to-day governance of the country unfold?
Well, I don't think we could expect Brazil's relationship between the executive and Congress to be as gridlock as we see in the US, because in Brazil, we have a very fragmented system, and parties are very ideologically fluid. And there are a lot of parties that, while conservative in name, they would play ball with Lula with the right incentives. So we have seen that the distribution of first-tier cabinet positions is already over, but we're going to see third, fourth-tier positions within ministries that can be used as a carrot for some parties. But depending on on specific pieces of legislation or projects or reforms that Lula will push forward, then he can negotiate from case to case. But there is a lot of space for Lula to negotiate with many parties, because a lot of the parties that were with Bolsonaro, they were also with Lula in Lula's first spell as president. They are less ideological and more keen on being close to power. So having the power of the pen will be a major asset in Lula in congressional negotiations.
Mario, I'm sure President Lula knows that he is facing a significant opposition in Brazil, and it would appear that he's adopted a very pragmatic approach to working with the opposition. But there are those in his base, among the people in his base, who supported the impeachment of former President Dilma Rousseff, which President Lula himself called a coup. So how does one sort of reconcile those contradictions?
Well, it's the art of politics. Lula knows, for instance, one of the ministers that he announced, Simone Tebet, she was very active when Dilma was impeached, but at the same time, she had a strong showing in when they had the congressional probe against Bolsonaro on COVID. So she gained a lot of favor there, and she ran for president, and on the second round she gave a strong support to Lula. So I mean, there's you have to overcome some of this old political bickering if you want to establish a government, especially like you mentioned. It is a more conservative or right-wing leaning Congress. So you need to old foes can be new partners, and this is probably what will make this government be able to pass legislation. They will probably not be able to pass everything they want. A lot of people, for instance, in the market are concerned about they rolling back on some economic reforms. That agenda is probably not going to have a lot of steam in the Congress, but they will find the support to pass most legislation that they need to govern the country, even if by definition this will be a less of a left-leaning government, because that's the configuration of the Congress and the society, and Lula is very aware of this and is already taking the steps to make this happen.
Gilson, Schwartz, let's talk about the Amazon. This is a part of Brazil that is of interest not just to Brazil, but to the entire world, given the climate change challenges that we face right now. Now, the new president, has chosen as his environment minister Marina Silva. She's a very high-profile activist who has vowed to stop illegal deforestation in the Amazon. She has shown us before that that is something that is very important to her and the country. But couldn't this also put the new president and his administration on a collision course with big agribusiness in Brazil?
Well, there is one comedian, a Brazilian comedian, that he made kind of a joke, but seriously, very meaningful, very interesting. He compared the Amazon to the Chinese wall. I was surprised with that comparison, but he's really right. I mean, China had a long-term project that united the people, united the nation. And I think that the environmental cause and all the knowledge, it's not just a matter of environment and environmental sustainability. There's knowledge, there's native people, there's a rational exploitation of agricultural pastures and agricultural crops. So there's lots of science and technology. When you talk about the Amazon, it's not just preservation. It's about innovation, it's about cultural diversity, and it can be really a long-term project. I'd like to stress that at least for 6 years, to say the least, the last 6 years, Brazil has gone through without any long-term planning. There was a very explicit project of destroying many instruments, many tools that were designed over the decades to bring Brazil to a new model of development. So I think that now this is going to be reconstructed, and the Amazon is a key element. You can see even before the inauguration, European countries already announcing that they're going back to the Amazon. They're funding investments there. And I think that we will see lots of public-private initiatives related to the ESG, related to governance, to sustainability, and to social inclusion. So it's really a different paradigm. If you don't take that into account, we're going to just, stick to the short-term macroeconomic indicators. But the Amazon is a huge asset. So we have to be very, very, very clear that this is a paradigm shift.
Michael Shifter, you were talking earlier about the political developments across Latin America. And if we look at the Brazilian election, it was almost, and I think we could say 50-50 as far as the electorate was concerned. We saw a similar situation in Peru as well as in Colombia. So what are we to make of this sort of broad left-right division on the continent?
Well, I think it's, I think, first of all, there are just enormous differences among the governments that identify themselves as left on issues of economic policy, of issues of democracy, on issues of climate change, on issues of drugs. I mean, you can go down the list, and all of these governments that in name are of the left in some ways, there are enormous differences. And second of all, I think the message is very clear that there's also a strong, because these elections were also close, that they're all very polarized. And if these governments don't perform well, more conservative parties, right-wing parties, will come back. This is not long stretches of leftist governments that we saw in the early 2000s with Chavez, with Lula himself having 2 terms, with the Kirchners in Argentina, with Evo Morales, with Rafael Correa. That's very, very unlikely. These governments are facing, as the other speakers have said, are facing much stronger constraints. If they don't deliver, then I think the pendulum will swing the other way. Okay, Gustavo, I've just got about a minute left. And if, again, we look at the picture in Latin America, 6 of the largest economies in the region are now controlled by left-wing governments. And this has led some people to say that, look, this could be a resurgence of what was known as the pink tide of the early 2000s. I mean, do you see that, or are we perhaps getting a bit ahead of ourselves?
I think there's a lot of nuance, and I think it might be more appropriate to call an anti-incumbency wave, because we saw a lot of these left-wing candidates, presidents, they ran against either incumbent presidents or the government's candidate. And that was the case in Brazil, for instance. A lot of the votes that Lula got were not necessarily votes for Lula, but votes against Bolsonaro. To comment on what Michael just said, in Brazil, that swing of the pendulum might be hard as well, because the power of incumbency in Brazil is so incredible. Bolsonaro, even if he has very little positive aspects of his government, he essentially threw everything but the kitchen sink to his re-election campaign and almost got re-elected, despite being the least popular incumbent in Brazilian democratic history.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global business, only on CGTN.